What happens when one of Hollywood's toughest living legends walks into a morning television studio, expecting nothing more than a routine promotional interview, only to be met with the most aggressive questioning of his entire career? What unfolds next becomes one of the most shocking and uncomfortable moments in live television history. What should have been a simple appearance to promote a new film slowly transforms into a brutal on-air confrontation, leaving viewers across the country stunned, social media in chaos, and one of America's most respected actors visibly shaken. By the end of it all, a man known for portraying unbreakable strength and moral certainty walks away in open disgust. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments, because this story is absolutely wild. The morning began like any other at the Good Morning America studios in the heart of Times Square. The streets outside buzzed with early commuters, flashing billboards, and tourists snapping photos, while inside the studio a well-rehearsed machine hummed into motion. Clint Eastwood had arrived early, scheduled to promote his latest directorial effort, a gritty western that critics were already calling a return to form. It was the kind of project audiences had come to expect from him, restrained, morally complex, and unapologetically old school. Inside the studio, makeup artists made final adjustments under bright lights, dabbing powder and fixing collars. Producers moved briskly across the floor with clipboards, headsets pressed tight against their ears as they coordinated cues and timing. Everything felt controlled, familiar, and routine. For George Stephanopoulos, this was just another high-profile interview. For Clint Eastwood, it was simply another stop on a long promotional trail. As the cameras rolled and millions of viewers tuned in from their living rooms, kitchens, and offices, the atmosphere was calm. Stephanopoulos sat with his notes neatly arranged on the small table between them, posture relaxed, expression friendly. He smiled as he welcomed the legendary filmmaker. "Good morning, Clint. Thank you so much for joining us," he said smoothly. "At 94, you're still making movies, still directing, still acting. What drives you to keep going?" Eastwood leaned back slightly in his chair, his iconic squint barely visible beneath the harsh studio lights. His voice carried that familiar gravelly tone, steady, measured, unmistakable. "George, I just like telling stories," he said simply. "Always have. When you love something, age is just a number. I wake up thinking about the next shot, the next scene, the next story that needs to be told." The audience response was warm. It was the kind of answer people expected. Humble, reflective, inspiring. Stephanopoulos nodded appreciatively, though there was something in his tone that suggested the conversation wouldn't remain light for long. "Your new film," he continued, "like many of your westerns, deals with justice and morality. Do you think audiences today connect differently with these themes than they did when you started making westerns back in the 1960s? Eastwood paused, folding his hands in his lap. He didn't rush his response. "Good storytelling is timeless," he said. "People understand right from wrong. They know when to stand up for what they believe in, when to draw a line. Human nature hasn't changed." "Interesting perspective," Stephanopoulos replied, shuffling his notes. To seasoned viewers, the gesture was subtle but familiar, a signal that the interview was about to shift. "Speaking of standing up for beliefs, you've been vocal politically over the years, supporting candidates, speaking at conventions, making statements that sparked debate." Eastwood's expression remained composed, but a slight tightening around his eyes hinted at rising tension. "I believe in participating in democracy," he said evenly. "Every American has the right and the responsibility to make their voice heard. Some of your statements have been controversial." Stephanopoulos pressed, his tone sharpening just enough to be noticeable. "The empty chair incident, comments about political correctness, positions on social issues. Do you ever regret taking strong stances that might alienate viewers who just want to enjoy your movies?" Eastwood's jaw tightened. "George, I say what needs to be said," he replied. "I don't worry about whether everyone agrees. I've been in this business for 60 years. You can't please everyone. You either make movies by committee, or you live your life trying not to offend anyone." Stephanopoulos leaned forward. "With influence comes responsibility," he said. "Don't you feel an obligation to be careful with your words?" Eastwood leaned forward too, locking eyes with him. "Careful with my words," he repeated. "I've chosen every role, every project, every statement thoughtfully. But careful doesn't mean silent, and it doesn't mean apologizing for convictions. The tension in the studio became unmistakable. Camera operators shifted slightly. Producers leaned closer to their monitors. This was no longer a friendly promotional interview. It was a confrontation, unfolding in real time, live on national television. Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. "Let me be specific, Clint," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of a prosecutor building a case. "You've made comments over the years that many people find troubling. About minorities, about women, about social progress. You've dismissed equality movements as political correctness gone wrong. How do you reconcile that with the heroic characters you've played on screen? Characters who stand up for justice and protect the innocent?" Eastwood's face hardened. The relaxed demeanor from earlier was gone, replaced by the steely resolve that had defined him in dozens of iconic roles. "George, I think you're mischaracterizing what I've said," he replied firmly. "And I don't appreciate the implication. I've spent my career making films about people doing the right thing, standing up to bullies, protecting those who can't protect themselves. My personal beliefs are consistent with that." "Are they?" Stephanopoulos shot back, clearly ready. "Because when you dismiss concerns about systemic inequality as political correctness, aren't you telling people facing real discrimination that their experiences don't matter?" The studio fell silent. And that's when everything truly changed. The question landed like a slap across the face, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. For the first time since the interview began, Clint Eastwood didn't answer immediately. He paused, lips pressed together, jaw working as if he were physically restraining himself from reacting. The seconds stretched uncomfortably long. The studio, moments earlier buzzing with controlled energy, seemed to hold its breath. When Eastwood finally spoke, his voice was lower now, controlled, measured. But beneath that restraint was a current of barely contained anger. "Listen here, George," he said slowly. "I have never told anyone their experiences don't matter. Not once. I've employed people from every background imaginable. I've told stories about all walks of life. I've treated people with dignity and respect my entire career." He leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Stephanopoulos. "But I will not apologize for believing that we've gone too far in the other direction, where people are afraid to speak their minds, afraid to have honest conversations about difficult topics." Stephanopoulos didn't hesitate. "But speaking your mind often means dismissing other people's pain," he countered. "When you make light of movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, you're not just expressing an opinion, you're minimizing real suffering. How is that any different from the villains in your own movies? Men who ignore the suffering of others because it's inconvenient for them." Eastwood's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. His knuckles turned white under the studio lights. "That's enough, George," he said sharply. "You're twisting my words to fit some narrative. I have never made light of anyone's suffering. Have you, though?" Stephanopoulos pressed, his tone relentless now. "When you mock safe spaces, dismiss trigger warnings, complain about political correctness, aren't you effectively telling traumatized people to just toughen up? Isn't that exactly what your movie heroes despise? And then it happened." "You're damn right people need to toughen up," Eastwood snapped. The words cut through the studio like a gunshot. The famed Eastwood composure, the calm, unshakable presence audiences had known for decades, cracked just enough to reveal raw frustration underneath. "Life is hard," he continued, voice rising. "It always has been. You face adversity. You deal with it. You move forward. You don't spend your life wallowing in victimhood, demanding everyone else change to accommodate your sensitivities." Stephanopoulos seized the opening instantly. "So trauma victims are just wallowing," he shot back. "People who have faced assault, racial violence, discrimination. They're just too sensitive." For a split second, Eastwood seemed to realize the trap. His eyes flickered, but instead of retreating he doubled down. "That's not what I said," he replied firmly. "But yes, there's a difference between acknowledging that bad things happen and turning every slight, every uncomfortable moment, every difficult conversation into a federal case." His voice steadied again, deliberate and forceful. "There's a difference between seeking justice and shutting down anyone who disagrees with you." "And who decides where that line is?" Stephanopoulos demanded. "You other wealthy, powerful men who have never faced discrimination." The implication hung heavy in the air. Don't you see the irony? Stephanopoulos continued. You've built your career playing characters who stand up to exactly that kind of power. The studio went deadly quiet. No applause, no murmurs, just the soft mechanical hum of the cameras and the faint voices from the control room bleeding through earpieces. Everyone, crew, producers, viewers at home, could feel it. The thin facade of morning television had been stripped away, replaced by something raw, confrontational, and deeply uncomfortable. Eastwood stared at Stephanopoulos, jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. His face strained, eyes unblinking. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, like the tense standoff before a gunfight in one of his classic westerns. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "George," he said, "I've been patient." He straightened in his chair, the weight of decades of authority in his posture. "I came here to talk about my movie, to share something I'm proud of with your audience. Instead, you've turned this into a political ambush, a character assassination disguised as journalism." A ripple of tension moved through the studio. "And I'm getting tired of it." Stephanopoulos didn't back away. If anything, he leaned in further. "Character assassination," he repeated. "Clint, these are your words, your public statements, your influence. Isn't it fair to examine how they affect people, especially those without your power or platform?" Eastwood let out a slow breath through his nose. His patience, already thin, was gone now. "What's not fair," he replied, "is pretending there's only one acceptable way to think. What's not fair is using people's pain as a weapon to silence disagreement. That's not compassion, that's control." Stephanopoulos opened his mouth to respond, but Eastwood raised a hand. "No, I'm done," he said. "I've answered your questions. I've been respectful. But I won't sit here and be lectured like I'm some moral villain in one of my own films." He shifted in his chair, clearly preparing to stand. "You want a headline, you want a moment, congratulations, you got one." The control room scrambled, producers gestured frantically, cameras hesitated, unsure whether to cut to commercial. Stephanopoulos tried one last time. "Walking away, doesn't that prove my point?" he asked. "When challenged, you shut down the conversation." Eastwood looked back at him, eyes cold. "No," he said quietly. "It proves I know when a conversation stops being honest." And with that he stood up. The chair scraped softly against the studio floor. A simple sound, but in that moment it echoed. Eastwood adjusted his jacket, nodded once, whether to the crew, the audience, or no one at all, and walked off set. The cameras kept rolling, America watched, and morning television would never quite feel the same again. "I'm asking you to account for your words, your actions," George Stephanopoulos said firmly. "If that feels like an attack, maybe you should consider why. Maybe the problem isn't the questions, but the answers you're being forced to give." Forced to give. Clint Eastwood's voice rose for the first time since the interview began, the familiar gravelly growl creeping back in low, dangerous, unmistakable. Heads in the control room snapped up. "Nobody forces me to do anything, George," Eastwood said sharply. "Nobody ever has, nobody ever will." He leaned forward, eyes blazing now, no trace of the earlier restraint left. "But what you're doing right now isn't journalism," he continued. "It's a hit job." The words hung heavy in the studio air. "You've taken every statement I've ever made out of context," Eastwood went on, voice firm and rising. "You've twisted every position I've ever held and tried to paint me as some kind of monster." "I haven't taken anything out of context," Stephanopoulos shot back immediately. "I'm quoting you directly. These are your words, your positions," he added, "and if you don't like how they sound when played back, maybe that says something about the positions themselves." Eastwood leaned in even closer now, his iconic squint fully transformed into a glare. It was the look audiences recognized, the look that preceded violence in his films, the look of a man done pretending. "You want to know what I think, George?" he said quietly. "I think this whole thing was planned from the start." A murmur rippled through the studio crew. "You never intended to talk about my movie, my work, anything I came here to discuss," Eastwood continued. "You brought me here to embarrass me, to tear down someone who thinks differently than you do. That's a serious accusation." Stephanopoulos replied, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "Are you saying that asking you to explain your public statements is unfair?" I'm saying twisting them, misrepresenting them, and using them as weapons is unfair. Eastwood shot back. And more than that, it's dishonest. His voice grew stronger, more forceful, filling the studio. That kind of dishonesty is what's destroying public discourse in this country. He said, "You want to talk about bullies, George? This right here, is what bullying looks like today." He gestured subtly toward the cameras, using your platform, your position of power, to humiliate people who disagree with you. For the first time, Stephanopoulos' composure visibly slipped. I find it rich. He said that someone with your platform, your influence, your wealth claims to be a victim of bullying. You've had 6 decades to use your voice however you wanted. He paused, then delivered the line that drew an audible intake of breath from the control room. And now, when you're asked tough questions, suddenly you're the victim. I never said I was a victim. Eastwood replied instantly. Authority radiated from every word. But I know dishonest journalism when I see it. I know a setup when I walk into one. He shook his head slowly. And that's exactly what this is. The tension in the studio became suffocating. Producers debated frantically whether to cut to commercial. Fingers hovered over switches. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming one of the most explosive moments in morning television history. Stephanopoulos wasn't finished. Do you think your attitudes? He pressed, voice sharp now. Your dismissive comments about social progress, your resistance to change, have contributed to the very problems you claim to care about. Has your influence made things worse for the people you say you want to help? That was it. Eastwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor with a harsh, metallic sound that sliced through the tension like a knife. Gasps rippled through the crew. That's enough, Eastwood said. I'm done with this circus, Clint. Please sit down, Stephanopoulos said quickly, suddenly uneasy. We still have several minutes left in the segment. No, George, Eastwood replied, his voice ice-cold. We don't. He adjusted his jacket slowly, deliberately. I came here in good faith. He continued to talk about my work, to share something meaningful with your audience, but you've made it very clear you have no interest in that. He met Stephanopoulos' gaze one last time. You're more interested in politics than conversation. I'm interested in accountability, Stephanopoulos insisted. An honest discussion about the impact of your words and actions. Eastwood began removing his microphone. Calm, controlled, precise, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Honest discussion, he repeated. There's been nothing honest about this conversation. He placed the mic gently on the table. You had your agenda from the start, Eastwood said. Nothing I could say would change your mind. You weren't listening. You were waiting. The studio was completely silent now. I've been in this business a long time, Eastwood added quietly. Long enough to know when someone isn't interested in understanding, only in scoring points. He took a step back, preparing to leave, and I don't play that game. Stephanopoulos watched him go, expression tight, as producers finally called for a cut to commercial. The cameras lingered just a second too long, capturing Eastwood walking off set, back straight, jaw set, refusing to look back. In living rooms across America, viewers stared at their screens in disbelief. What was meant to be a routine morning show interview had exploded into a raw, unscripted confrontation about power, speech, accountability, and media itself. And once again, Clint Eastwood had walked away, this time not from a movie scene, but from live television history. So you're just going to walk away? George Stephanopoulos' voice cut through the studio, sharp and challenging, as Clint Eastwood took his first step toward the edge of the set. For a brief moment, it seemed like Eastwood might ignore him completely. Then he stopped. Slowly, deliberately, Eastwood turned around. He stared down at Stephanopoulos with that unmistakable, piercing gaze, the look that had frozen villains mid-sentence in countless films. The studio lights caught the lines in his face, etched by age, experience, and decades spent staring down conflict, both real and imagined. George, Eastwood said calmly, though the weight behind the word was unmistakable. I've faced tough questions all my life, tough situations, tough people. He took a measured step back toward the desk, not to sit, but to be heard. But I don't waste time with people who aren't interested in honest dialogue, he continued. And I don't waste time with people who invite me onto their show under false pretenses, just to tear me down. You're a public figure, Stephanopoulos shot back. Asking about your public statements isn't false pretense. Eastwood straightened, standing tall now, his posture commanding despite his age. He looked down at Stephanopoulos, not angrily, but with a firm certainty that left no room for negotiation. "No, George," Eastwood said. "Journalism asks fair questions, and then listens to the answers. Journalism tries to understand perspectives, even the ones it disagrees with." His voice hardened. "What you've done today isn't that." The studio fell completely silent. "What you've done today," Eastwood continued, "is activism masquerading as journalism, and I won't be part of it." No applause followed, no gasps, just the low hum of studio equipment, the quiet breathing of crew members holding still, afraid to break the moment. Everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Morning television stripped of its smile, its pleasantries, its carefully maintained illusion. East would let the silence linger. "You know what the real irony is," he said finally, his tone heavy now, not with anger but disappointment. "The characters I've played, the stories I've told, they're about people standing up to exactly this kind of behavior." He gestured subtly between them. "People refusing to be bullied, refusing to be silenced, refusing to back down when they know they're being treated unfairly." His eyes never left Stephanopoulos, "and that's exactly what I'm doing right now." Stephanopoulos opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His confident posture from earlier had faded. He sat still, hands folded awkwardly on the desk, the reality of the moment finally sinking in. Eastwood turned away. There was no dramatic flourish, no final insult. No raised voice, just resolve. He walked toward the exit of the set, his footsteps steady, unhurried. The sound of his shoes against the studio floor echoed far louder than it should have, each step punctuating the end of a confrontation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. The cameras kept rolling, producers hesitated, seconds stretched, unsure whether to cut away or let the moment breathe. The silence on screen became uncomfortable, then surreal. Millions of viewers watched as George Stephanopoulos sat alone at the desk, blinking, processing, clearly unprepared for how completely the interview had slipped from his control. Eastwood didn't look back. He disappeared beyond the lights, beyond the cameras, leaving behind a stunned studio and a national audience still trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Finally, mercifully, producers cut to commercial. In living rooms across the country, social media exploded. Clips began circulating within minutes. Headlines were drafted in real time. Viewers argued over who was right, who was wrong, and whether the line between journalism and confrontation had finally been crossed live on air. What was meant to be a routine, promotional interview had become something far more raw and revealing. And in that moment, without raising his voice, without needing the last word, one of Hollywood's greatest legends reminded everyone exactly why you don't mess with Clint Eastwood.